Okay.
Hi, welcome to this conference. Name Unmasking the Economy with Steve King. Hola, bienvenidos a esta conferencia. This conference is organized by the Comité Local de la Facultad de Economía de la Asociación Nacional de Estudiantes de Economía. Professor King, it's wonderful to have you here. Thanks a lot. Professor King is a leading economist and professor of economics and finance, known for his heterodox approach and radical critique of neoclassical economic theory. He is currently a professor at the University of Western Sydney and served as a head of School of Economic History and Politics at Kingston University in London a few years ago. Professor King, thanks a lot. This is a great opportunity for all of us to hear you. You are going to present once again your book, debuting economics. 6 or 8 years ago, you were here in Mexico presenting your book. So it's wonderful to have you here again. Please feel free, Professor, more or less 50 minutes, an hour, anytime you need and wish to give us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I expect to go longer than 50 minutes, partly because I'm very loquacious and partly because we need to translate to Spanish. So, okay. So I will, if I can, I imagine I'll hear the translation as you do the translation. Is that correct? Or? Yeah, I think that should be. Okay, well, I'll start now. I'll just share my screen. Okay. And you did mention debunking economics. I've since written several other books. The one I would most recommend to follow up on what I'll talk about here is this one, The New Economics, a Manifesto. So I'm not, should I speak again? Okay, I'm really not sure here. Okay, so what I want to talk on is both dismantling and rebuilding economics. We need to get rid of mainstream neoclassical economics. We need a sensible replacement, and both are possible. So I have embedded a new book, unpublished by me, into the PowerPoint slide. So I will send that to you, and you will be able to download that and extract it from the presentation here. And I'm going to start with the foundations of neoclassical economics, which really begins with the idea of micro foundations. The idea you must derive macroeconomics from microeconomics. And that is both unnecessary and wrong. It's wrong because of what are called complex systems. And this is a paper by a great physicist, Philip Anderson, who said that reductionism does not imply constructionism. The fact that we can reduce everything to simple laws doesn't mean we can use those laws and rebuild the universe. And his conclusion was psychology is not applied biology, nor is biology applied chemistry. And from my point of view, our point of view, macroeconomics is not applied micro. That is just a fallacy. The true foundations of macroeconomics are actually macroeconomics itself. And I wish to illustrate that. You can build the foundations of a realistic economics by working straight from definitions of macroeconomic concepts. And micro foundations, which is the focus of the mainstream, is a pointless waste of time. We should no longer do it. The origins of wanting to do microeconomic foundations was to give sound foundations to macroeconomics. But the way it's been done violates scientific logic, as I mentioned above from Philip Anderson. So what I want to show is you can build macroeconomics that no one can reject out of hand from macroeconomic definitions themselves. And these lead to complex systems, visions of the macroeconomy, not equilibrium. So let's just take a few definitions. The employment rate. That is simply the number of people employed divided by population, and I call that lambda. The wages share of GDP, which I call omega, is total wages divided by GDP. The debt ratio is private debt divided by GDP. I just had one more person to admit here, pardon me. I hope that's happened. Can somebody else handle admitting new arrivals? Thank you. Okay. And the final ratio is government spending, net government spending divided by GDP. Just those four definitions. Now, you can turn those into dynamic equations by using logarithmic rules of differentiation. So if I define x hat to be 1 over x dx dt, then x divided by y hat is x hat minus y hat, and x times y hat is x hat plus y hat. Very simple rules. Then add some extremely simple extra definitions and parameters. And those are what I'll use in this talk. So the capital to output ratio I show as K subscript Y superscript R. Okay. Change in capital due to depreciation I show as delta KD depreciation. Trying to use very simple symbols that actually indicate what they are supposed to be, rather than just Greek letters and so on. So I will quickly show how this applies just by using the employment rate and wages share of GDP. So if we define Y hat, that is L divided by N hat, and that is L hat minus N hat. And that simply says the employment rate will rise if employment grows faster than population. That is a fact. That is not a theory. Then omega hat is W hat minus Y hat, and that says the wages share of GDP will rise if total wages grow faster than GDP. That is also a fact. Now, to expand this out, I then make some substitutions. So I have L inside the equation here, and I can substitute that with Y divided by the output to labor ratio. That is again definitional. And I substitute N hat for delta N, which is the rate of change of population. So I then go from this expression to this one. I now have Y hat divided by YLR, which becomes Y hat divided by minus YLR hat minus delta N. This is all very mechanical. I need to say what Y hat is, and since I've defined Y to be K divided by capital output ratio, which I used the wrong expression there for, pardon me, I then get Y hat is K hat. And if I then define the rate of change of capital to be investment, which is gross investment minus depreciation, then I get out the rate Y hat is gross investment divided by capital minus depreciation. If I then assume that all profits are invested, this is now output minus wages. And with one more line of logic, I finally say the rate of change of the employment rate is 1 minus the wages share over the capital output ratio minus depreciation minus change in the output to labor ratio minus change in population. The wages share of GDP is a similar exercise, and it's simplified by some cancellations that apply. And having done that, I get a basic dynamic model. This is saying the rate of change of the employment rate is 1 minus the wages share divided by capital output ratio minus change in amount of depreciation minus change in the output to labor ratio minus population change. And when I express those in the forms of differential equations, those are the equations I get. Now, if I simulate that, pardon me, this is, in fact, Richard Goodwin's growth cycle model. So working from strictly true macroeconomic definitions and adding a few simplifying assumptions, I get Goodwin's model, which is in this paper. And therefore, I see Goodwin's model, not Ramsey's growth model, as the true foundation of macroeconomics. And it's inherently cyclical. It is not a model that reaches equilibrium. So when you run the model, and this is now running the model in my software Ravel, and shocking it once, you get permanent cycles. The economy is cyclical. This model generates that result. Now, if I then add in the debt ratio, which I showed earlier, I get Hyman-Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And that you can see best in the book by Minsky, Can It Happen Again? An excellent book of readings. And Minsky argues that we should analyze capitalism from the point of view of the relationship of private debt to GDP, and take an economy that is doing well at the moment, but has had a crisis in the past. As you move forward in time away from the crisis, people forget, and companies which had a lot of debt actually do better through leverage. What this leads to is instability. As Minsky put it here, the fundamental instability of a capitalist economy is upward. The tendency to translate doing well into a speculative investment boom is the basic instability of a capitalist economy. If I now simulate that in Ravel again, this is what happens. Cycles, which diminish over time, but then start to grow. A rising level of debt to GDP, private debt to GDP, ultimately rising instability, and finally a crisis, like the Great Depression. I'll go on from there. If I add in prices, rather than getting equilibrium, we get what I call Fisher's paradox after Irving Fisher. And you see, again, a similar process. It looks like you're heading to stability, and then deflation occurs, and the economy collapses. And debt ratio becomes infinite, ultimately, which again is the Great Depression. Away it goes. Now, this is what Fisher argued back in the 1930s, that if there's too much indebtedness and falling prices at the same time, The more debtors pay, the more they owe. Deflation amplifies debts. Attempts to reduce debt increase the debt ratio. The economy collapses completely. Now, if you add the government to this, you get stability, not in equilibrium, but in the avoidance of collapse. And this is from a paper by a group of Brazilian economists. And they said, when you've added in the government, you can guarantee that the employment rate does not remain indefinitely trapped at arbitrarily small values. In other words, you don't have a complete collapse, okay? Which is in sharp contrast to where you have no government, where you can collapse completely. Okay? And so their interpretation of my model was a sufficiently responsive government can bring the economy back from a state of crisis. And when you simulate this model, this is what you see. Looks similar, first of all. But then you get very different cycles. And the system continues cycling indefinitely, but does not break down. It'll go on like that forever. So you don't get equilibrium, but you don't get breakdown either. Now, that's what we could do with macroeconomics if we avoid microeconomics entirely. But when you look at neoclassical microeconomics, it's both logically and empirically false. So, for example, the way you're taught about the market demand curve is frankly a lie. Okay? This is from the Samuelson and Nordhaus textbook. And they say, does the market demand curve obey the law of downward sloping demand? It certainly does. This is economic theorists on the demand curve. Okay? This author says there's an impossibility theorem. Okay? Allocating the same totals differently amongst people must change the resulting equilibrium price ratio, which means you don't get downward sloping demand curves unless tastes are identical, not only for all men, but for all men when they are rich or poor. Another author says strong restrictions are needed to justify the hypothesis that the demand curve slopes downwards. So only in special cases can the economy be expected to act as an idealized consumer. The utility hypothesis tells us nothing about market demand. Now, your textbooks are lying to you, in other words, about both supply and demand. Notice here, this is Samuelson in a textbook. This is Samuelson in a research paper. They know differently. They don't want to teach it. They don't want to believe it, frankly. Now, when you look at the supply curve, that is based on the idea of diminishing marginal productivity. When economists look at the data, they don't find that. And here is Alan Blinder in the 1990s saying the overwhelmingly bad news for economic theory is that only 11% of GDP is produced under conditions of rising marginal cost. Of course, the textbooks teach something completely different. So these are the results that Blinder found when he surveyed, I think, 100 major companies in the northeastern corner of America. Decreasing marginal cost, 42.5, constant, 48, only 11% diminishing rising marginal cost. And that is actually an optimistic result because Blinder and his student interviewers were biased to believe the textbook. When you have a different approach being taken to the questionnaires, this is the sort of result you get. This was a survey in 1952, 1 year before I was born, asking manufacturers, both the company directors and the manufacturing managers, to say which of those 8 diagrams most suited their production costs. Those are the results they got. The company directors in the by company column, product managers in the by product column. There is the neoclassical model. That's what you see in your textbooks. U-shaped cost curve. One company director reported that out of 334, no product managers. This one, 3 companies, directors, no product managers. This lot, which are inconsistent with the theory, but suit Piero Schrafer, Mikhail Koletsky, and Andrews, who I haven't mentioned yet, almost everybody. Okay. So what that means is 99% of firms have constant or falling marginal cost. They don't have rising. And this has been known since the 1930s. This is Andrews again from 1949 in a paper called The Reconsideration of the Theory of the Individual Business. That's what he drew as the standard situation for most firms. You had constant average costs, so no marginal costs constant, falling fixed costs, which aren't shown here, therefore average total cost decline. They said that's the standard company. They said, given that this is so generally adhered to, the mystery is that it has not yet emerged as a postulate of economic analysis. Why an economist use this? Okay. He said it should be obvious. This is what firms tell us. Okay. So he said when economists think about this, they try to explain this on the basis of existing theory instead of accepting it. So I want to show what that leads to if you do actually take it seriously. And this is an engineer talking about why the real situation is different to what textbooks teach. Engineers design factories. They design them to be most efficient at maximum capacity. Therefore, the short-run marginal cost curve will always lie below the average, right out to capacity. Therefore, profit rises right out to capacity. So you can now define profit to be price times quantity minus constant variable cost times quantity minus fixed costs. Pardon me. If you differentiate that, that tells you the rate of change of profit is price minus variable cost, which is a constant. Okay. If you look at profit per unit, that is price minus variable cost minus fixed cost divided by quantity. Differentiate that, you find that is fixed cost divided by quantity squared, which is greater than 0. So what is happening is fixed cost per unit fall, you have an increase in profit per unit. Now, why does this not mean infinite output? It's because firms produce differentiated products into a market size that is given by the macroeconomy. And firms compete not on price, but on product evolution. So this is showing the graphical version of the same. As quantity rises, variable cost remains constant. Price remains constant, list price. The gap between the two is the markup set by the firm. If the firm reaches its target output, it makes target profit. If it goes out to capacity, it makes a larger profit, based on both a larger quantity and a larger gap between total cost and price. Now, this gives an evolutionary pressure for firms to grow and to differentiate their products. That's the real world, and that's what we should be teaching. And what neoclassical economics teaches is a myth, an unscientific myth. So what you see when you look at the real world in empirical data and you look at it logically, capitalism is inherently cyclical. It's evolutionary, not equilibrium. It's liable to collapse into a debt deflation. It can be stabilized by counter-cyclical government spending. And all those conclusions are derived from definitions that neoclassical economists cannot dispute. And this justifies what is known as system dynamics, which is what my Ravel software is designed to do. And it also lets you explain the system to politicians and journalists in a way that you can't when you work in equilibrium terms. So what I've done in designing the software that I now call Ravel is to try to make it as transparent as possible and as visible as possible. So it's still difficult for non-experts, but it's far easier than reading computer code. So this is the same model I showed initially of Minsky and financial instability, but done using flowcharts. So rather than equations, I have output divided by the output labor ratio is labor, divided by population is the employment rate. That feeds into a wage change function, which gives you the rate of change of wages, which times wages and integrated is the wage, multiplied by labor is wages, output minus profit minus wages and interest payments, which are covered in the model, give you profit. That determines investment, and you get a model which you can actually read. And this leads to the same outcome that I showed in the previous model of a debt deflation. And you could design enormous models with Ravel. Okay? This is just a toy model. You can design individual components like wage determination, investment, foreign trade, banking, etc., and then integrate those together as blocks when each part is finished. So this is a model done by a close colleague of mine of basically the global economy with climate change, population growth, the biosphere, and the economy all included in the one system. That's the model there. So if you download it later, you can take a look at it inside Ravel. Okay? Now, also one thing conventional economics teaches is you don't need to worry about money when you model macroeconomics. That is completely wrong. When you include money, you find that money has real effects. So this is a simple way that I've built to illustrate this, where I have a table that I call a Moore, M-O-O-R-E, a Moore table, named after Basil Moore, where you have expenditure on the horizontal row and income on the column. So households spend $8 per year on services and $B per year on manufacturing, and the row necessarily sums to zero. Same for services, same for manufacturing. So when you look at this, what you get is that income can be greater or less than zero, okay? But the table necessarily sums to zero because someone's spending is somebody else's income. Okay? And the negative of the diagonal across here, that is aggregate expenditure. Okay? And the sum of the off diagonal is aggregate income. And they are necessarily equal. So that's the starting point. Now, if I take a look at the neoclassical idea of what banks do, which is called loanable funds, then that is one sector lending to another. So what I have here, the services sector lends to the household sector. And then the house spends that money on the manufacturing sector. And of course, the services sector can't spend that money because it's lent it. So what you get is credit cancels out. Interest payments do not cancel out. So interest is part of aggregate expenditure and income, but credit is not. And that's the model that neoclassicals have in their heads about banking. Okay? So if they were right that banks were intermediaries, it would also be correct to leave credit out of the equation. But it's a fiction. Issuers create money when they lend. And I call this bank originated money and debt, or BOM, B-O-M-D. And now what you have is credit is created by the banking sector increasing its assets and increasing its liabilities. That's happening there. The borrower spends credit on the manufacturing sector, and credit does not cancel out. Both aggregate expenditure and aggregate income include credit. So putting it simply, aggregate demand is the turnover of existing money plus new credit. So by assuming loanable funds, neoclassical economists have ignored the major determinants of cycles in capitalism. And this is showing the relationship between credit and unemployment in America between 1990 and 2014. Now, according to conventional neoclassical economics, that relationship should be not different from zero, not significantly different from zero. Instead, the correlation of credit and unemployment has an R squared of 0.84. So a huge difference between what neoclassical economists believe and the real world. So I invented Ravel to make it possible to model the economy using monetary flows, and that's where the software can be now purchased from. And what Ravel allows you to do is to model the monetary dynamics of a capitalist economy. So this is a very simple model of the 1920s America, where I show that if the government did what the Coolidge government actually did, but the private sector does not lend money, which they did very much during the 20s, then there would have been a recession in the 1920s, the opposite to what actually happened. So neoclassical economics is wrong about foundations. It's wrong about the stability of the system. It's wrong about demand. It's wrong about supply. And it's wrong about money. And I'm going to show now it's wrong about energy as well. So this is a little saying that I came up with in about 2017. You must have energy in your models of macroeconomy, because without energy, workers are dead and machines are statues. They don't move. So you need energy to make anything happen. And this is looking at energy and gross world product over the last 50 or 60 years. And the correlation between the two is huge. Okay? So fundamentally, you can say that GDP is energy converted into useful work. And this means that for a start, Leontief's production function is superior to Cobb-Douglas. And the reason for that is simple. Cobb-Douglas is based on the idea of substitution, but there is no substitute for energy. If you don't have energy, nothing can move. So what you see, what's called the capital to output ratio, is actually the inverse of the efficiency with which machines turn energy into useful work. So that's the way you can combine economics with ecology. And you get, as I showed in that previous slide, an extremely high relationship between change in gross world product and change in energy, correlation coefficient of 0.83. And that's possible, therefore, to take the modeling software I showed you earlier and include ecology, showing, in this case, depletion of physical resources. but you could also show pollution and so on. Okay. So what you need is models that let us integrate the ecology and the economy, and that is quite feasible. But because neoclassical economists have not done this, they don't understand climate change either. And that's where they've done the worst work they've ever done. So this is William Nordhaus, Nobel Prize winner, saying that it was difficult to find major impacts upon almost the entire economy because of global warming. And what he's left out is energy. That's the vital thing he doesn't understand. So they ignore the biophysical nature of production. They apply cost benefit to what is actually an existential question. And therefore, I think neoclassical economists will destroy capitalism. So I've written a report on that, which you can find at those links there. I'll include this when I send the presentation your way. And this is a popular article on my critique of Nordhaus, saying they're basically idiot savants. They have no idea of what they're doing, and they're sincerely doing things which will destroy capitalism, which they think they're defending. So to give you an idea of how bad their work is on climate change, here is a contrast of what economists say and what scientists say. So a recent paper claimed that losing 8 critical elements of the biosphere, Arctic summer sea ice, Greenland, the West Antarctic, the Amazon basin, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, and 2 more elements, would reduce GDP by 1.4%. Scientists in a group led by me said it is simply ridiculous to claim that losing those elements of the planet will have almost no impact upon GDP. They were stunned that we thought that losing Greenland, the West Antarctic, the Amazon, would have a more significant impact than they'd estimated. Again, we simply said, it is ridiculous to claim that huge changes to the planet would have almost no impact upon the economy. Okay? And there's a huge gulf between what natural scientists know is climate change and what economists think it is. And that's the final point I want to talk about in a fair bit of detail. So economists and scientists don't talk to each other. And there's a huge problem. So for example, you may have heard of what's called the thermohighland circulation, which is a huge ocean current that is 30 times the size of all the rivers on the planet. And part of that is called the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation that keeps Europe warm. And that could be tipped by the melting of Greenland. So that's the structure. It's a huge ocean current through all the world's oceans. That's the bit that get turned off by melting of ice from Greenland and the Arctic Circle. Okay. Economists thought that if that gets turned off, that will improve gross world product by 1.3%. Scientists said if that goes, that will cause a critical challenge to food security, and it would have a catastrophic impact. Now, who do you trust? Economists on climate change or scientists on climate change? And what actually happens when you read the literature is that economists misread what the scientists write. So here are scientists writing in 2008. Society may be lulled into a false sense of security by smooth projections of global change. Current knowledge suggests a variety of tipping elements could reach their critical point within this century. Here is how Nordhaus summarized that. He said his dice model is smooth and doesn't have sharp tipping points, but that's consistent with Lenton. He then said Lenton's survey found no critical elements with a time horizon of less than 300 years and temperatures less than 3 degrees. Now look at this. That's the scientists. That's what the economists claim the scientists said. That's what the scientists said. This is what Nordhaus said they said. It's a flat contradiction. You cannot trust the economists to read the scientists properly. And equally, the scientists have got more worried as time has gone on. So in 2008, Lenton's group said that they thought the AMOC collapse would be gradual and would need about 3 degrees of warming. This is back in 2008. A recent paper says that, in fact, they're fairly confident, like 95% confidence, that the AMOC will tip between next year and 2095. Meaning that within your lifetimes, almost possibly within my lifetime, the AMOC will stop and Europe will be plunged into an ice age. And the rest of the world will warm up. So how do the economists reach these stupid, insanely bad results? First of all, they fit their models to numbers that have nothing to do with climate change. So they use what they call the enumerative method. And this is Nordhaus talking about it. And the punchline is here. He assumes 87% of the economy will be unaffected by climate change. Again, that quote I showed earlier. He can't see how climate change will affect the economy over the next 50 to 75 years, so out till 2060. Okay? He simply assumes that a roof will protect you from climate change. Tell that to the people in Acapulco. But this is the sort of assumption they make. They then also take data on geography and temperature and assume they can apply that to climate change and temperature. So they use variations in GDP and temperature as a proxy for climate change. And this is the sort of thing they'll say. This is a dispute that I triggered on Twitter with one of the neoclassicals. And he said, people thrive in very different climates. So climate does not affect economy particularly. And if the relationship does not hold over space, then you can't say it holds over time either, which is insanely stupid. They then extrapolate what they find in current data across tipping points. So here is, again, a very recent paper saying that if there's a 0.01% or 0.01 degree increase in temperature, growth will be lower by 0.05 percentage points per year. And they then do this extrapolation. And that's over 4 degrees of warming, at which point major tipping points will occur. Okay? And a similar paper here. They simply assume the climate will not change as temperature rises, which is ridiculous. Okay? And therefore they give these what look like large predictions, but they're trivial in scale. They also use a quadratic, damages equals temperature squared, to approximate the damages that are going to occur from climate change. And they've been criticized about this for 15 years. They continue using quadratics. They do not listen to criticism. They don't reform themselves. So they're incredibly dangerous advice. Now, what that has led to is economists believing that 7 degrees of global warming would only reduce GDP by 20% compared to what it would be in the complete absence of climate change. So that translates to a 0.1% fall in the rate of economic growth. Okay? Now, that's how accurately we measure GDP today. So they're saying the impact of climate change will be unmeasurable. Scientists say, on the other hand, 5 degrees of warming will probably drive us extinct. That's how big a gap there is between the climate scientists and the economists. They even ignore rainfall. So what they call their integrated assessment models, which economists write, they do not use what the climate scientists develop as climate models. Instead, they make up their own models, and they don't include rainfall at all. Okay? So here's a paper from 2021 saying, yes, losing the AMOC will change rainfall, but we don't include rainfall in our models. Okay? And what they therefore say is that they simply assume that if the temperature gets better, then so will the rainfall. And that's ridiculous. That is simply ridiculous. Okay? Scientists, on the other hand, because of changes to rainfall as well as temperature, AMOC collapse will reduce food production by about 70%, which means global famine. And they even assume that climate change damages goods, but doesn't damage factories. So this is another integrated assessment model called PAGE, and they assume that damages from climate change were repaired every year at no cost, which is, again, simply crazy. Okay? They call it a conservative assumption. Okay? They assume impacts only occur in the year and don't continue on. That is not conservative, that is radical. And when you look at what could happen, this is taking an American database called the Billion-Dollar Damages Database, showing all the storms that have happened over the last 45 years. And you can extrapolate that using a quadratic or an exponential or a logistic. So if I do that within the data range, those are 3 functions there, and you cannot tell them apart. But if you extrapolate them, this is what economists are using. This is what could happen. And we'll see that divergence happening in a very, very short period of time. So economists assuming there'll be no big damages for centuries. Climate scientists, on the other hand, think we're going to see catastrophes, not only this century, maybe even this decade. Now, what could happen? Well, one of the examples is this is research by the professor at Harvard University who discovered the collapse in the ozone layer back in the 1980s. And he said, if we have an increase in storm strength in the Gulf of Mexico, that could cause loss of the ozone layer, particularly over America. And that could happen at 500 parts per million. We are currently at 420. So his logic is much more moisture in the Gulf of Mexico, much bigger storms on the US plains. Those storms penetrate the stratosphere, and by taking both water and chlorine and bromide into the stratosphere, that will cause a catastrophic loss of ozone, which would mean it's impossible to go outdoors. So I want to show what we've set ourselves up for and why it's so important to eliminate neoclassical economics. It's dangerous for the survival of humanity. That is the temperature profile of the last 2,000 years. That's when the Industrial Revolution began, and you can see the rise in temperature afterwards. Okay. That is looking back 10,000 or 12,000 years. That's when the pyramids were built 4,000 years ago. That's the oldest known man-made large structure in Turkey, 12,000 years ago. If we go back 100,000 years, there was an ice age. That was the last glacial period. And that was 6 degrees cooler, 4 to 6 degrees cooler than we are now. So human civilization began on that little bit there, okay, the last 12,000 years. If we go back further still, last 1 million years ago, we have what are called Milankovitch cycles, that are natural cycles caused by the orbit of the planet around the sun and wobbles in the planet as well. And those are the peaks of the Milankovitch cycles, about 100,000 years apart. Okay? Humans evolved then. Okay? There's only been 3 or 4 peaks since then. That's the last 2 million years. So ice ages began 1.5 million years ago. If we go back further still, this is 70 million years now. That is when the dinosaurs were wiped out. So that's the long-term history. The planet has been getting cooler, but we are now going through crazy cycles in temperature. Happened to be when we evolved as a species. So if you go back and look at the last 100,000 years, we evolved civilization on the peak of a heat hill. If we were sensible, we would have kept that temperature controlled, and we would have had the science fiction future that people imagine. If we hadn't increased temperature, we would have gone back down here somewhere, back to ice ages. What we've done instead is increase global temperature at 30 times the speed of its natural cycles. And that is the path of suicide. That's the path to Mad Max. And that's the path we're on. So this cartoon you may have seen before. Okay? I think it's unfortunately a good prediction of the future. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment, we created a lot of value for shareholders. That's the world we're going to be in. So what can you do? First of all, if your lecturers teach you neoclassical theory, challenge them. Oh, pardon me, I pressed the B. Okay. Support them if they give you realistic alternatives. Okay. Use my software and learn how to do dynamic modeling. That's where you can get a copy from. And learn economics from realists like me rather than neoclassical economists. So some of you who've read Debunking, I also recommend the New Economics. I have a Patreon website and a Substack. My posts there are generally free. Okay. I would appreciate support, but don't do it if you can't afford to support me. Okay. And I have online courses as well, which are also expensive. I hope to give cheaper courses through Twitter later this year. Okay. But that is my message. I hope I didn't go too quickly. So let's talk.
Well, thanks a lot, Professor King. My mood is a mixed one after listening your wonderful conference. Tenemos un espacio para algunas preguntas y respuestas. Si alguien se anima, we have a few minutes to ask questions and answer by Professor Kim. No sé si alguien se quiere animar, si los organizadores me ayudan a administrar esto. Oh, well, I really enjoy your conference, Professor. Yes, indeed. Waste of time, false. The texts are lying to us. It's an insane and stupid neoclassical theory, which is moving us as a civilization to a nightmare.
It is a nightmare, true. Yeah.
It's a nightmare, Professor. What to do? Yes, of course, what to do. Eliminate neoclassical theory in our schools of economics, of course. No sé si alguien quiera preguntar, chat. I'm going to... no veo nada por aquí. Eh, ah, 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 eh, ¿Cuáles cree que serán los desafíos de la economía latinoamericana? Well, it is a really a specific question, Professor. Which are the challenges that the Latin American economies face right now? I don't know if you want to say something about it.
I think a major challenge for Latin America is the level of inequality. You have much higher inequality than America, which is outrageous but true. So Gabriela Palmer, from memory, wrote a beautiful paper comparing capitalist and worker consumption in America to capitalist and worker consumption in Latin America, particularly Argentina. And he said capitalist consumption was about 30% of GDP in America and worker consumption 70. He said in Latin America, capitalist consumption was 70%. Okay. So that huge inequality is a major problem you face. And of course, you know how brutal the ruling class can be in enforcing that. So not exactly giving you an easy solution to say the level of inequality is one of your major problems.
Yes, Professor, indeed, thanks a lot. Yes. No sé si alguien más se anime. Anything else? Anyone? What to do? You propose an answer, Professor. But also in the middle, you mentioned the government actions to stabilize the economies and government spending. That would be enough to stabilize our economies. Spending.
That's one of the great problems is neoclassical economists advise the government should run a balanced budget. But that actually means the government does nothing to stabilize the economy and does not create any fiat money. So the government creates fiat money by spending more than it gets back in taxation. If it doesn't do that, it either doesn't create fiat money or it destroys it if it runs a surplus. So rather than stabilizing, the government policy is destabilizing the economy. That's a major problem. And equally, they're doing nowhere near enough for global warming. Absolutely nothing by comparison to what we need. So we should have had spending to finance private sector investment. The government deficits enable that by giving corporations debt-free money from their point of view for investment and working capital. That hasn't happened. So instead, the huge speculation we've seen on borrowed private money has happened instead. And of course, because they haven't created the fiat money, we've had less industrialization. The rate of economic growth under neoliberalism has been half what it was beforehand. We don't have the infrastructure. We haven't developed alternative energy systems. So they've made it harder for us to respond to global warming now. So I'm quite terrified about the future, quite frankly. I really am.
Yes, Professor. There is a question by Jennifer. Given the biggest countries that contaminate don't really participate in projects to reduce their pollution, what will it take for them to change their ways? Yes, let me rephrase the answer, the question. Yeah. Of course, the more you produce, the more you contaminate. So that's your problem, your responsibility in first place.
Yeah, I think the only thing which will lead them to changing their ways is if lots of white people die.
Once again,
the only way politicians in the global north will change their ways is if large numbers of white people die in environmental catastrophes. Okay, they don't worry about brown people, they don't worry about black people, they will worry about lots of white people. Okay, so if Texas, for example, if Texas has a massive flood, huge heat wave, and the power system fails and 40 or 50 million Texans die of wet bulb temperature, then they might take it seriously. But before that happens, they won't. And then when it does, of course, that will destroy their capacity to respond. So this is the terror. This is the terror.
That's true. I agree, Professor. Okay. What should we look after to avoid another global economic recession? Well,
I no longer think that's an important question, because I think global warming is going to destroy the economy before we see another recession. We should have, without global warming, we should simply have had government spending being sufficient to produce fiat-based money, and we should have reduced the level of private debt by about 60%. I've been arguing for 2 decades now for what I call a modern debt jubilee. Pardon me. So we should have used the government's capacity to create money to cancel private debt and keep it below 70% of GDP. It's currently about 170% in most countries around the world. That hasn't happened. It will never happen. So we will be caught with stagnation caused by too high a level of private debt most of the time. When governments run austerity, they will reduce the rate of growth even more. And then on top of all that, sometime probably before 2030, I think we will see catastrophic damages to the economy from climate change, which in the first instance, because when shareholders, when speculators realize that climate change is serious, they'll also realize the valuation they've put on companies is far too high. They'll try to liquidate. We'll have a financial crash caused by climate change.
Okay, Professor, thank you. Meanwhile, what about the international coordination? For example, here in Mexico, where we have a leftist government right now, some sort. But if an economy as the Mexican one, the government will spend money generating imbalances in fiscal imbalances, immediately we will have an attack, a speculative attack. So it's difficult for a small economy as a Mexican one to try to implement another kind of policies. What's your opinion?
Well, again, it's extremely difficult to be independent in the global economy we have right now. The one thing that I think you should be doing is building up resilience against climate catastrophes.
Okay.
So you should be building up food stocks, okay? Deliberately storing grain, corn, wheat, rice, have massive stores to prevent, if there is a famine, then you can feed people in the meantime. You need domestic capability for diesel oil to be able to continue moving food around. And you need to foster a sense of cultural support. Okay? Mexicans take care of each other, that type of attitude, rather than focusing upon economic growth. So my feeling is everything is dominated by climate change now. So expect there'll be catastrophes, plan to be able to attenuate them. And one group that I'm involved with is called MIR, by the way, which stands for Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing. And they're one of a number of small private volunteer groups that are trying to get, because they know the governments are not doing it.
Mhm.
So their idea is to build mirrors, very cheap from discarded plastic, which can reflect solar energy back into outer space. And that both reduces extreme temperatures. When you put it in like a ghetto or ordinary houses, you reduce the internal temperature by 7 Celsius. And you also, so you make houses more livable, and you also reduce the level of global warming. So I would be hoping to see groups like that receive government support funding, because if we don't have the capacity to do this before climate starts to break down seriously, then we won't be able to build that capacity when it has broken down. So again, everything comes back to climate change for me.
Okay, okay, Professor. Thanks a lot. Well, creo que ya no hay ninguna pregunta, estudiantes. Si me indican si ya cierro el evento. Well, Professor King, really, we appreciate your time, your effort, your books. Thanks a lot for this
Thank you.
wonderful conference. It was recorded, so a lot of people will watch you. Okay,
Thank you.
Professor King, thanks a lot. Muchas
Thank you.
gracias a
Bye.
todos,
Okay.
estudiantes. Thanks a lot. See you,
Bye-bye. Bye.
Professor. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Muchas gracias a todos, a todas, a los organizadores, al comité local de la Facultad de Economía, de la UNAM, de la Asociación Nacional de Estudiantes de Economía. Fue una gran conferencia, un gran manejo de PowerPoint, lo vieron, muchas habilidades ejecutivas del profesor, y bueno, todo el contenido crítico y realmente el pesimismo, así lo dijo, ¿verdad? O sea, tenemos que dejar de perder el tiempo, de eliminar, así lo dijo, ¿verdad? La teoría neoclásica de las currículas, de los planes de estudio, y la prioridad ya es el cambio climático. En nuestros países tenemos que prepararnos, suficiencia alimentaria, energética. Tenemos que dejar de pensar en crecer y crecer y crecer. Todo esto lo dijo el profesor King. Tenemos que evidentemente mejorar la distribución, ¿verdad? Del ingreso. Le pregunté explícitamente, ¿verdad? ¿Cuándo van a reaccionar los gobiernos, las economías del norte a propósito de la pregunta de Jennifer? Y dijo, solo cuando enfrenten ellos y su población privilegiada, plutocrática, las catástrofes, ¿verdad? Grandes, grandes catástrofes, a un costo de vidas, de muchas muertes. Solo así los gobiernos de estos países van a empezar a reaccionar, pero también lo dijo, pero ya cuando ocurra, ya habremos perdido las capacidades para precisamente enfrentar de mucho mejor manera los desastres económicos. Habló de los tipping points, ¿de acuerdo? Hay 9 sistemas de la Tierra. Es la teoría, es la ciencia de los sistemas de la Tierra. Hay 9 sistemas de la Tierra, cosas que no entendemos los economistas. Habló, por ejemplo, del ozono, y en 4 o 5 ya rebasamos los umbrales. A eso se refieren los points, ¿verdad? O sea, son puntos de no retorno. Debe ser la prioridad en verdad. O sea, yo lo comento en clase, ¿verdad? Ustedes van a vivir en unas décadas esta pesadilla, así la clasificamos. Claro que mientras los profesores aquí, las y los van a seguir enseñando economía ambiental, ¿verdad? Instrumentos económicos, valoración económica, ¿verdad? Economía ambiental neoclásica, ¿verdad? Eh, eh, vivimos en un momento crítico y ustedes lo van a vivir, ¿de acuerdo? Bueno, organizadores, ¿les parece bien si cerramos? Por favor, abran sus micrófonos, despídanse. Bueno,
No, pues muchas
Jimena,
gracias, doctor Lizardi. Creo que, pues, cultivar esta parte del espíritu crítico, pues, en las y los compañeros, pues, sigue, pues, llenando, ¿no? De perspectivas, pues, lo que es la ciencia económica, que a final de cuentas creo que, pues, está o malinterpretada o medianamente interpretada por las y los estudiantes, o de plano jalan mucho de lo que los profesores les transmiten, y eso, pues, también es algo que tenemos que pues que cuidar y cuestionar, ¿no? Siempre con una perspectiva crítica, diría yo.
es
Y pues nada, pues
urgente,
muchas gracias a los asistentes y a usted.
muy bien, es
Dígame, doctor,
urgente.
perdón.
Cuando presenté en mis redes, en Twitter, en Facebook, dije, el profesor va a ir en contra del relativismo de las ciencias y la falsa pluralidad. O sea, suena bien que tengamos programas plurales, no, plurales sí, pero no científicos, ¿verdad? Y sus palabras, charlatanería. Estoy citando de nuevo, es insane, dijo, es estupidez enferma, ¿verdad? Eh, Son no científicos, unscientific mencionó, entonces, pluralidad, pero de ciencias, ¿verdad? No de charlatanería. Tenemos que repensar bien el plan de estudios. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Fue un gusto estar aquí con ustedes y nos vemos creo que en el Narciso Basols en un ratito. ¿Vale? Me voy a desconectar. See you alligators. Muchas gracias.